Chapter 0.0 Introduction, Part 3. This subheading is Art and Creativity. So we'll get into training and untrained artists, creative impulse, and how people naturally respond to images and seek to express themselves visually. The first thing we're going to look at, and this is much brighter than it is in the book, so you kind of can see it a little bit better, 0.0.10. James Abbott McNeill Whistler, otherwise known as Whistler. You think of Whistler's mother. Same guy. So this is Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket, and this is 1875. And if you recall my comment about photography coming into play in the 1860s, and that also falls into the same timeline as the Civil War, and it was the first war that was depicted in photographs and brought home, and the first time that non-battle participants, meaning, people outside the military, were seeing images of war, because those images would travel home or be in the circulated. Wouldn't say newspapers. I don't think that technology existed at that time. So there's no need for the image to be hyper-realistic and detailed. In 1875, it can become abstracted to a degree. So this is before we really have a high claim or a multitudes claim like Picasso, Matisse, and Mondrian and other people really start to claim abstraction in the early 1900s. And sort of similar time frame of the Impressionists. The Impressionists are the ones we think of as things getting blurrier and less distinct. But Whistler here is giving us this painting of the falling rocket, sort of a fireworks display, and some water and a reflection. And he's trying to evoke emotion here, and he's trying to express the overall chaos of the scene, and in so doing, he obliterates some of the detail. And John Ruskin, who's a critic, very famous critic, says that this was a mess, and he doesn't think that this was worth, the money it was asked. So on page 26, 27, bottom of 27, bottom of 26, beginning of page 27, the British critic John Ruskin described the painting as lacking in subject matter and quality and shamed the artist for asking, quote, 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face, end quote. So Whistler, our artist, sued Ruskin and won, but the money that he spent on the lawyer led him toward bankruptcy, unfortunately. So Whistler's argument, or where he was coming from, is I'll quote again from the book here, page 27, that Whistler, he believed its value lay not just in the time it took to make the work, like, maybe he did throw some paint on, but also in the knowledge he had gained over a lifetime, which he shared with the public through the work. So he wins his case, and he's trying to say that, all the skills and all the time that artists are working, it's not something that there's an hourly rate for, in other words, that this is accumulation of all his sensibilities and training. So that's what he's trying to say is happening in this painting. Plus, he's trying to show the emotion and the meaning in this painting. So he's predating abstraction, and when we get into the abstract expressionists about 75 years later, those guys are saying, or even a little earlier, they're saying that it's a blank canvas with just white or black or a little bit of yellow or just a giant area of color, and the emotion I put into those brushstrokes is what you should be getting out of it. And that held sway for quite a while in the mid-1940s, 50s, in that area, mid-20th century. But he's ahead of his time here, Mr. Whistler, and he's trying to show us an emotional painting with a lot going on and trying to capture the the emotion of the time. Art for art's sake, I don't know if you've heard that expression. Clement Greenberg, who is a critic that was in favor of abstract expressionists in the 40s and 50s, he wrote quite a bit about art for art's sake, and many cultures hold to this truth that an artist is exploring some part of themselves or part of the culture and showing us this work. It really doesn't matter that it looks like something or not. Okay? So who makes art? We're going to get into another subheading. Single individual or many people. And I know it's kind of always, I think students, every time I show like an interview and a real close-up video of an artist's life in studio, they're always shocked that there's like 25 people in that room. You know, I mean, some artists work with less, but rarely is it that one person's making art in a corner. That idea or ideal is something portrayed in the media, but that's not really the truth generally. If it's an artist you recognize, an important artist, even from the past, but definitely in the 20th century, 21st century, it takes so much to get an artwork out there. You have a publicist, you have a manager, you have a gallery director, and then you have several interns or paid people that will do the rough work for you. And in some cases, artists have very little to do with their own work other than the ideas or the drawings or the blueprint, if you will. Then we'll get into famous or anonymous, and then the training or lack thereof, master student, guilds, and academies. We touched on academies a little bit in the previous video, and then naive or outsider artists. So our first example here is going to be a Japanese tea bowl by Hon-Ami Koetsu, and this is from the Edo period, 17th century, so 1600s, that's what that means. Raku ware, maybe you've heard of this technique. It's raku fired. Now the raku firings we generally do that are Japanese technique, you usually develop cracks in the ware, and it doesn't really hold water, so it's a slightly different. The glazes are maybe a little different, the clay is a little different, but you can see this has a few cracks. But our idea here, or the point in showing you this tea bowl, is this is the aesthetic from Japan. That's quite different than it would be from the Renaissance in the Western world, which would be contemporaneous. Contemporaneous means at the same time. The Western world is looking at painting, right? And architecture and sculpture. Those are the important high art forms. But in Japan, pottery is held in high regard. And the tea ceremony this tea bowl would be used in the tea ceremony, and it would be similar to a ritual object, but it's also considered a high art object. So the concept or the construct is different. There's a blurring in Japan between high and low art, or craft and fine art, if that makes sense. So some of that has pervaded our culture in the art world, especially on the West Coast, in California and Oregon and Washington, Seattle, kind of thing. That this idea of high and low mixed together, or there's different sort of values put on objects, that's started to blur things a bit, because coming from the West, we would have said, oh, it's pottery, it's functional, it has a lesser value. I'm going to spend $10 at Target and get a functional object. But because the tea ceremony really embodies Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, so closely, which is in high regard their religion and culture, and the tea ceremony is done very slowly, and the tactile feel in your hands would have been important as much as looking at the surface of this bowl. And subtlety in Japan is highly regarded. So we have sort of an abstract, subtle, textured surface. The glaze is irregular, and those irregularities would have been embraced. So when the person is drinking this tea bowl, they're going to turn it so that the front, if there's a design, sometimes there's a central design on one side, not always, but sometimes there are, and that would be presented away from the drinker. They'd be showing it to the other person in the room. Usually there's two people drinking tea in a tea ceremony. It's not always that way, but usually. And then they would turn it and then they would look at the image themselves or the central area of interest themselves, and then they would interact with it. So you're turning the tea bowl, you're looking at the different sides, this irregularity, this lip. This is called the Mount Fuji tea bowl. It's very famous. This irregularity would also be highly prized. So irregularity, lack of uniformity, lack of industrial looking pottery would be the height of the aesthetic, and also objects such as craft objects that we would consider low art would be high art in Japan. So you have to remember there's a difference in each culture how things are regarded. If you think of Native American culture, weavings and ceramics are very important, sand paintings. So very different than what we would be looking at, what would be valued. So on to the Mona Lisa. We can't get through the book or any art history book really on Western art history without talking about the Mona Lisa. And there's just the French says je ne sais quoi, I don't know, or a gestalt, or there's a lot of different terms you could use. But what we would say, I think, in modern parlance, what we would say is there's an X factor to the Mona Lisa. We don't know why we are obsessed with her, the most famous painting on earth. We don't know what it is exactly. You can't quite put your finger on it. And that is one of those things with art and creating things that is just so amazing. Of course, Leonardo da Vinci is incredibly gifted. There's a lot of craftsmanship going on in here. There's a lot of time and effort, but that really doesn't equal to something is sometimes more than the sum of its parts, if that makes sense. So we're not sure exactly what it is about her, but we focus on her face and that her eyes are looking at us no matter which way we go. And she's not quite smiling. She's about to smile. And this sort of movement and change of an emotion, that might be one of our guesses of why she captivates us so much. But it's a famous portrait, and I don't know. I think our book is saying that this is a meditation of the human soul from the landscape. We don't exactly know why we find this so compelling, but we absolutely do. And I will just throw in that Leonardo is somebody who was highly trained and is a part of the system of apprenticeship and so on. He learned to paint from a master. So it's a meditation on the human soul. So it is a person. It was made after a person, but this individuality that she has is just kind of that something special that he's really captured the spirit of her, if you will say. Many other cultures also regard that quite highly. I don't know if they know about the Mona Lisa, but many cultures would say capturing somebody's essence like that would be really important. And remember, this was not a famous person, and it wasn't that highly regarded at the time, but since post-Renaissance, it definitely was. Okay, so next we have an art patron here, very famous art patron in the early 20th century, Gertrude Stein. This is a Man Ray photograph from 1922 of Gertrude Stein. Man Ray is a very famous surrealist, Dadaist, and he's got one more ism, and I'm not thinking what it is, but he's somebody who was very famous, and part of her salon, one of her members of coming to her house, and it would be sort of like a bunch of people coming to discuss different topics and wine and cheese and snacks and so on. She's a wealthy woman. She would be hosting all these different artists and thinkers and so on. So it wouldn't just be strictly artists. There'd be some other people that would be pertinent at the time. Man Ray is an artist, of course. And then Picasso, this portrait that was painted of her, was also an artist that was very close to Gertrude Stein. In this case, what we're arguing here, or what our book is saying, in 1905, I'm going to read from page 29, there's an inset blurb on her. 1905, Gertrude Stein commissioned Picasso to paint her portrait. She wrote that she sat for Picasso 90 times. He worked on the painting for months but was never satisfied. Eventually, he abandoned the naturalistic approach and painted out the details of her facial features after seeing ancient Iberian, that's part of Spain, sculptures in Spain and at the Louvre Museum in Paris. When comparing Stein's actual appearance with her painted likeness, we see that Picasso replaced the soft contours of her cheeks, eyes, and mouth with mask-like forms. The painting is now famous not only because it represents their interaction, but also because it inspired a new phase of Picasso's work. So this is him starting to go toward Cubism, and we look at some other paintings a little bit after this time, because remember, this painting here is 1905. Maybe he finished it in 1906, but that's when he was asked to start, is 1905. And this photograph is 1922, so this is 17 years later. And of course, she still highly regards both Picasso and her painting. But the idea that she's kind of exposing him to all these different ideas in her salon, her group of people that are around. She's an arts patron, so perhaps like through the thin times, she's funding some people, food and rent and that sort of thing. And then, of course, commissions like the one that Picasso did for her. But this rumination on her and this encouragement for him to explore new ideas got him into Cubism, which is what he is mainly known for. Picasso is known for many things. He's an innovator and a huge artist who lived a long time.